Today I'd like to talk about methodology, which is also an important element in writing a research proposal and in any kind of research project that one is planning. So methodology is the process of collecting data. It's a way of going around identifying the data that would support your argument in your study. And one of the best ways to do that is actually to begin to think about the concrete question that I had suggested for you. So the question, I remember I said make it as concrete as possible, related to a key term in the study of religion. Now I want you to return to the concreteness in the field. And then you need to ask yourself, what kind of data do you need in order to answer that question? What was the question, and what is then the data related to that? So usually there will be, in methodology, there would be one prominent methodology, but often there would be one or two or perhaps even more sources of data that you would need. But you might, I think, usefully for the moment think about one prominent source of data that stands central, and other sources of data that may support you in one way or another. Let me go through at least a few of these data sources that will help you to think about the methods that you would use in order to collect your information. So since we're talking about the study of religion, I think we should begin to start with texts first, because many religions, but not all, are rooted in texts. Those texts can be written texts as such, but you might also begin to think about oral texts that you would like to record. But I want to leave oral text or orality in a separate category. So let's talk about text. The texts are the sacred texts themselves, the commentaries, the whole list of publications that are coming through from religious sources as such. Texts that require to be read, that can be dated, that can be collected as such. So that's the first kind of text that you would read. But do not forget that texts not only belong to very early periods of the religious history. You might also look at text in the form of sermon texts that have been published, or books that are published by religious leaders that fill the religious bookstores around our city and in the country and the world in general. So that's the text that one wants to look at. Identify the text, what they say, what they claim as such, as data for yourself. The second type of data would be certain method that you might want to use is to look at to use observation. Here, think about making yourself a kind of a wallflower when you go inside a religious center or a religious community, and you start observing with your senses everything around you. Keep a notebook and make a record everything that you see, that you hear, that you smell, everything that is around you. Try to be as thorough as possible. You may not necessarily direct your attention in a way, but you basically open yourself up to observation. A third source of data might be that you look at, you collect surveys. This is a particularly specialized type of collection data where you formulate questions very carefully, and then you send that information to a large number of respondents. You're not so much interested in the identity of the individual, in the personality of the individual respondent, but as long as you have categories about gender, categories about age, categories about class, about geographical location, you can collect views from religious people in surveys. The surveys would be large number of questions which have very specific and definitive answers, and you can put that through a program. Another way of a method of collecting data is through interviews. Interviews might, again, the way that I'm thinking about it, that I've used them in the past, would be life trajectories, where you would identify individuals, a number of individuals, and collect the stories of their lives on a particular topic or sometimes on their lives in general. If you are interested in the biographical tradition in general, you could do that, or if you are interested in the life trajectory of a person involved in a particular organization, then you can direct your questions to that as well. Usually these interviews would I suggest be 1 to 1.5 hours, carefully constructed sentences, but also fairly open-ended if you compare them with the survey questions that you might want to look at. Interviews would also be very useful in collecting oral history. You might be looking for a history or a religious life in a village where there are no written records, or there are no texts that have been published. So in that case, you might want to look at people who remember or think they remember very well the events, and then you collect their recollections, you record their recollections in interviews. Another source of data that you might want to look at is consider media, and here I'm talking specifically about news reports or contemporary eyewitnesses that give you an insight about a particular development in religion or particular event as such. So for the last 100 or more years, we've had newspapers recording on a daily basis what is going on in the city or what is going on in the country. So you could use such newspapers in order to collect data that you would not otherwise have if you do not rely on that. You might find people writing travelogues, or maybe people writing impressions about what is going on. As the internet gets older, we might actually look at the recordings on the internet, or the impressions left on the internet as a historical source. So you could look at old newspapers that are in the internet, or maybe old blogs that are written by individuals on the internet. All of these I consider to be media that you use as sources of information that you might need in order to answer that concrete question. You might want to look at the archives. Some of the religions have a very long history, and sometimes that history is recorded in archives, usually written by governments or by individuals who have left their impressions or they left the documents behind. They are now captured in a government archive. Sometimes you might even find it in a university archive. So if you want to look at, say for example, the religions in South Africa, I think the African Studies Library has got a fascinating archive that you could look at. These will be old documents, financial documents, minutes of meetings, reports written by government officials, reports written by religious ministers that you would find in the old archives that are written out there and that you would look for as data. Finally, I would like you to look also at the media, the form in which religions are presented or represented for the audiences or maybe for the broader public out there. So here I'm not only interested in the texts and the announcements that religions make, but perhaps looking at also the oral or the visual sources or the visual effects that are very much part of religious traditions. So you might find that you're looking at religious recitations of texts and other kinds of perhaps psalms and songs that you can collect, that you can collect through audio recordings, or that you can record through a video. Pay particular attention here to what we call the aesthetic dimension of a religion that has often been overlooked when scholars only focus on the texts or focus only on the official documents that are left behind or that are focused upon in the study of religions. So the media, in this case, represent the media in the religious tradition. My earlier, this media within religious traditions should be distinguished from media about religious traditions, like newspapers and things like that. So, with that kind of a broad overview of the type of methods that you might use in order to collect your data, let me leave you with a few important tips that you might find useful. So before you start, make a list of what you need. Make a list of the methods that you are going to be using in order to answer your question. Remember, the question should always be prominent when you are thinking about methods, and then you look at the most appropriate methods of the ones and maybe others that I have mentioned, that you make a list, 2 or 3 or sometimes perhaps only 1, as I said, of the dominant method. Then you plan your method. You plan a method, make sure that you have the equipment. If you are using sound recording, make sure that you have that you have good recording equipment. The settings are correct. There are enough batteries or enough power that you have in order to collect the data. That your camera works well. That your camera has good capacity in order to record either the videos or the photographs that you are going to take. Then thirdly, what you should be making a habit of is that you keep a notebook. A notebook would be important for the observations that you make when you are on site, when you are talking to people, when you are listening to people. But also importantly, at the end of every day, that you conclude the day with a summary of the impressions that you have to make. So if you are going on a research trip for 2 or 3 weeks or maybe more, you would have, for every day that you are doing research, that you collect impressions, that you record your impressions. Apart from what you are collecting in your, from the text that you are collecting, from the recordings, from the interviews that you are doing, from the photographs that you are taking, you write also a summary of your general impressions, everything that has happened, what are the relationship between you and your informants, the relationship between you and the religious event that you have been experiencing as such. And I think with this kind of data, both the very specific data that you have collected through the methods that you have chosen, all the data that you record in your recording devices, cameras or videos or sound recordings, and then your general impressions would provide the necessary information that would help you to answer your concrete question and to develop your argument in the way that you have thought about, or in the way that you have imagined has emerged from your theoretical reflection.